to, and signed by the commissioners, that he might take immediate possession. Edward turned pale as he laid the document down on the table. "We will ride to-morrow, Edward, and look it over. I intend to rebuild the house." Edward made no reply. "Are you not well?" said the intendant, with surprise. "Yes, sir," replied Edward, "I am well, I believe. But I confess to you that I am disappointed. I did not think that you would have accepted a property from such a source, and so unjustly sequestrated." "I am sorry, Edward," replied the intendant, "that I should have fallen in your good opinion. But allow me to observe that you are so far right that I never would have accepted a property to which there were living claimants, but this is a different case. For instance, the Ratcliffe property belongs to little Clara, and is sequestrated. Do you think I would accept it? Never. But here is property without an heir. The whole family perished in the flames of Arnwood. There is no living claimant. It must be given to somebody, or remain with the government. This property, therefore, and this property only, out of all sequestrated, I selected, as I felt that in obtaining it I did harm to no one. I have been offered others, but I have refused them. I would accept of this, and this only, and that is the reason why my applications have hitherto been attended with no success. I trust you believe me, Edward, in what I assert?" "First answer me one question, Mr. Heatherstone. Suppose it were proved that the whole of the family did not, as it is supposed, perish at the conflagration of Arnwood. Suppose a rightful heir to it should at any time appear, would you then resign the property to him?" "As I hope for heaven, Edward, I would," replied the intendant, solemnly raising his eyes upward as he spoke. "I then should think that I had been an instrument to keep the property out of other hands less scrupulous, and should surrender it as a trust which had been confided to me for the time only." "With such feelings, Mr. Heatherstone, I can now congratulate you upon your having obtained possession of the property," replied Edward. "And yet I do not deserve so much credit, as there is little chance of my sincerity being put to the test, Edward. There is no doubt that the family all perished, and Arnwood will become the dower of Patience Heatherstone." Edward's heart beat quick. A moment's thought told him his situation. He had been prevented, by the interruption of Mr. Heatherstone, from making his confession to Patience, and now he could not make it to anybody without a rupture with the intendant, or a compromise, by asking what he so earnestly desired, the hand of Patience. Mr. Heatherstone, observing to Edward that he did not look well, said supper was ready, and that they had better go into the next room. Edward mechanically followed. At supper he was tormented by the incessant inquiries of Clara, as to what was the matter with him. He did not venture to look at Patience, and made a hasty retreat to bed, complaining, as he might well do, of a severe headache. Edward threw himself on his bed, but to sleep was impossible. He thought of the events of the day over and over again. Had he any reason to believe that Patience returned his affection? No, her reply was too calm, too composed, to make him suppose that. And now that she would be an heiress, there would be no want of pretenders to her hand, and he would lose her and his property at the same time. It was true that the intendant had declared that he would renounce the property if the true heir appeared, but that was easy to say upon the conviction that no heir would appear. And even if he did renounce it, the Parliament would receive it again, rather than it should fall into the hands of a Beverley. "Oh, that I had never left the cottage!" thought Edward. "I might then, at least, have become resigned and contented with my lot. Now I am miserable, and whichever way I turn, I see no prospect of being otherwise. One thing only I can decide upon, which is, that I will not remain any longer than I can help under this roof. I will go over and consult with Humphrey, and if I can only place my sisters as I want, Humphrey and I will seek our fortunes." Edward rose at daylight, and, dressing himself, went down and saddled his horse. Desiring Sampson to tell the intendant that he had gone over to the cottage, and would return by the evening, he rode across the forest, and arrived just as they were sitting down to breakfast. His attempts to be cheerful before his sisters did not succeed, and they were all grieved to see him so pale and haggard. As soon as breakfast was over, Edward made a sign, and he and Humphrey went out. "What is the matter, my dear brother?" said Humphrey. "I will tell you all. Listen to me," replied Edward, who then gave him the detail of all that had passed from the time he had walked out with Patience Heatherstone till he went to bed. "Now, Humphrey, you know all, and what shall I do? Remain there I cannot." "If Patience Heatherstone had professed regard for you," replied Humphrey, "the affair had been simple enough. Her father could have no objections to the match, and he would at the same time have acquitted his conscience as to retaining the property. But you say she showed none?" "She told me very calmly that she was sorry that I had said what I did." "But do women always mean what they say, brother?" said Humphrey. "She does, at all events," replied Edward. "She is truth itself. No, I cannot deceive myself. She feels a deep debt of gratitude for the service I rendered her, and that prevented her from being more harsh in her reply than what she was." "And if she knew that you were Edward Beverley, do you not think it would make a difference in her?" "And if it did, it would be too humiliating to think that I was only married for my rank and station. But, considering you of mean birth, may she not have checked those feelings which she considered under the circumstances improper to indulge? Where there is such a sense of propriety, there can be little affection." "I know nothing about these things, Edward," replied Humphrey, "but I have been told that a woman's heart is not easily read, or if I have not been told it, I have read it or dreamed it. What do you propose to do?" "What I fear you will not approve of, Humphrey. It is to break up our establishment altogether. If the answer is favourable from the Misses Conynghame, my sisters shall go to them, but that we had agreed upon already. Then, for myself, I intend to go abroad, resume my name, and obtain employment in some foreign service. I will trust to the king for assisting me to that. That is the worst part of it, Edward. But if your peace of mind depends on it, I will not oppose it. You, Humphrey, may come with me and share my fortunes, or do what you think more preferable." "I think, then, Edward, that I shall not decide rashly. I must have remained here with Pablo if my sisters had gone to the ladies Conynghame, and you had remained with the intendant. I shall, therefore, till I hear from you, remain where I am, and shall be able to observe what is going on here, and let you know." "Be it so," replied Edward. "Let me only see my sisters well placed, and I shall be off the next day. It is misery to remain there now." After some more conversation, Edward mounted his horse and returned to the intendant's. He did not arrive till late, for supper was on the table. The intendant gave him a letter from Mr. Challoner, which was enclosed in one from Mr. Langton, and further informed Edward that news had arrived of the king having made his escape to France. "Thank God for that!" exclaimed Edward. "With your leave, sir, I will to-morrow deliver this letter to the party to whom it is addressed, as I know it to be of consequence." The intendant having given his consent, Edward retired without having exchanged a word with Patience or Clara beyond the usual civilities of the table. The following morning, Edward, who had not slept an hour during the night, set off for Clara's cottage, and found Chaloner and Grenville still in bed. At the sound of his voice the door was opened, and he gave Chaloner the letter. The latter read it, and then handed it on to Edward. The Misses Conynghame were delighted at the idea of receiving the two daughters of Colonel Beverley, and would treat them as their own. They requested that they might be sent to London immediately, where the coach would meet them to convey them down to Lancashire. They begged to be kindly remembered to Captain Beverley, and to assure him that his sisters should be well cared for. "I am much indebted to you, Chaloner," said Edward. "I will send my brother off with my sisters as soon as possible. You will soon think of returning to France, and if you will permit me, I will accompany you." "You, Edward! That will be delightful. But you had no idea of the kind when last we met. What has induced you to alter your mind?" "I will tell you by and by. I do not think I shall be here again for some days. I must be a great deal at the cottage when Humphrey is away, for Pablo will have a great charge upon him, what with the dairy, and horses, and breed of goats, and other things, more than he can attend to. But as soon as Humphrey returns, I will come to you, and make preparations for our departure. Till then, farewell, both of you. We must see to provision you for 3 weeks or a month before Humphrey starts." Edward bade them a hearty farewell, and then rode to the cottage. Although Alice and Edith had been somewhat prepared for leaving the cottage, yet the time was so very uncertain that the blow fell heavy upon them. They were to leave their brothers whom they loved so dearly, to go to strangers; and when they understood that they were to leave in 2 days, and that they should not see Edward again, their grief was very great. But Edward reasoned with Alice and consoled her, although with Edith it was a much more difficult task. She not only lamented her brothers, but her cow, her pony, and her kids; all the dumb animals were friends and favourites of Edith, and even the idea of parting with Pablo was the cause of a fresh burst of tears. Having made every arrangement with Humphrey, Edward once more took his leave, promising to come over and assist Pablo as soon as he could. The next day Humphrey was busied in his preparations. They supplied the provisions to Clara's cottage, and when Pablo took them over in the cart, Humphrey rode to Lymington and provided a conveyance to London for the following day. We may as well observe that they set off at the hour appointed, and arrived safely at London in 3 days. There, at an address given in the letter, they found the coach waiting, and having given his sisters into the charge of an elderly waiting woman, who had come up in the coach to take charge of them, they quitted him with many tears, and Humphrey hastened back to the New Forest. On his return he found, to